Have you ever noticed that in today's society, people are reacting faster and faster, speaking more and more, yet rarely truly thinking? A story appears and is immediately split into sides. An opinion is voiced and instantly labeled right or wrong. No one asks further. No one pauses. No one bothers to question their own thinking. Everything moves very fast, very loud, and very certain in a way that is deeply unsettling. The great psychoanalyst Carl Jung once warned that when people stop dialoguing with their inner world, they become easily dissolved into crowd psychology. At that point, we no longer think through individual consciousness, but react through borrowed emotions. We repeat what others say. We believe what makes us feel safe, not what is true. The ego is soothed, while intelligence is gradually numbed. What is frightening is not the existence of ignorance. It lies in the fact that critical thinking is quietly disappearing, making room for collective stupidity, something that always speaks in the name of the majority, morality, or obvious common sense. In this video, I will walk with you through why this is happening, how it operates in everyday life, and why even intelligent people can become part of the crowd without realizing it through 10 subtle yet deeply real signs. And don't miss sign number 10, because it will clearly show just how much your daily choices and thinking habits are shaping the collective as a whole. Sign 1. Thinking trained to be obedient. Carl Jung once said, "The greatest danger to the individual is adaptation to the collective. The greatest danger to a person is not opposition, but adapting too perfectly to the crowd." There is a kind of loss of critical thinking that happens very early and very quietly. So quietly that most of us never notice it. It is not loud, not shocking, and it leaves no clearly painful memories. But it is persistent enough to follow us through many years of growing up. It is the moment when a person learns to be obedient, to fit into the mold, to do what is expected, and gradually trades away their right to think independently. We often believe that people grow up, go to school, go to work, collide with society, and naturally learn how to think. But reality is not that simple. Most of us do not naturally stop thinking. We are trained not to think differently. From a very young age, the first rewards we receive are not for curiosity or depth, but for compliance. Children are praised for giving the correct answer, not for asking unusual questions. They are liked when they are obedient, not when they question too much. They are considered good when they follow instructions, and they are reminded, corrected, or even lightly punished when they stray from the mold. At first, this seems harmless. A classroom needs order, a family needs structure, a group needs consensus. But the problem is not order or discipline. The problem lies in the repeated implicit message. Safety lies in sameness. Difference is trouble. Asking questions is inconvenient. And over time, the child no longer needs reminders. They learn to regulate themselves. They learn when to stay silent. They learn when to nod. They learn that some thoughts are best left unspoken. The dominant emotional tone formed in that environment is not intense fear, but a very mild yet persistent anxiety. Fear of being wrong, fear of being different, fear of being judged. No one forbids you from thinking, but you gradually learn to avoid the discomfort that arises when your thoughts do not align with those around you. You stop asking, "Is this true?" and start asking, "Is it okay to say this?" This shift is extremely subtle. It does not kill intelligence. It simply makes intelligence cautious, overly careful, and eventually silent. When we grow up, that pattern does not disappear. It only changes form. In the workplace, compliance continues to be rewarded. The person who is easy to work with is often valued more than the one who asks difficult questions. The person who knows their place is trusted more than the one with strong opinions. In meetings, you quickly realize that raising an unpopular issue can make the atmosphere heavy, and so you learn to stay quiet, not because you do not see the problem, but because you have learned that collective comfort often matters more than personal truth. The same is true in social relationships. There are safe topics and sensitive ones. There are viewpoints that are easily accepted, and viewpoints that can get you labeled as difficult, negative, or divisive. And when forced to choose between maintaining harmony and maintaining your own thinking, many people choose harmony, not because they lack thoughts, but because they are deeply accustomed to paying a price for being different. Through a Jungian lens, this is not personal weakness. It is a very natural unconscious mechanism. The ego always seeks safety, and in a social environment, safety is often equated with belonging, acceptance, and not being excluded. To achieve that, the ego is willing to identify itself with external norms, willing to borrow the collective value system as its own, willing to give up its individual judging function as long as the sense of safety remains intact. The problem is that when this happens too early and for too long, people lose the ability to distinguish between choice and conditioned reflex. They believe that this is simply how they are, that they do not like debating, that they are not good at critical thinking, that they are not suited to disagreeing with the majority. But very often, that is not their nature. It is not who they truly are, but a habit formed over many years. Obedience brings calm, while difference always comes with a bit of trouble. You can see this clearly in everyday situations. In a meeting, you notice a flaw in the plan. You can clearly see that it will cause problems later, but when you look around, everyone is nodding. No one speaks up, and you hesitate. One part of you says you should speak. Another part whispers, "Are you sure? What if you're wrong? What if you make everyone uncomfortable?" In the end, you stay silent. The meeting ends smoothly, and you leave with a feeling that is hard to name. Not intense regret, but a slight heaviness in your chest, a sense that you have abandoned your own thinking. Or in social conversations, when a common opinion is repeated and you sense that something is off, instead of speaking up, you nod to get it over with. You might tell yourself, "It's a small thing. It's not worth arguing." But each time you nod, you reinforce a habit, placing external acceptance above internal honesty. What makes this especially powerful is that these moments are not big enough to feel like self-betrayal. They are too small, too ordinary, and precisely because of that, they are effective. They gradually erode your ability to trust your own judgment. Over time, you not only fall silent in front of others, but also in front of yourself. You stop digging deeper into your thoughts. You stop pursuing a doubt all the way through, because even in your own mind, you have grown accustomed to self-censorship. If at this point, you feel a slight sense of unease, pause for a moment and ask yourself, when was the last time you stayed silent, even though you disagreed? It does not have to be something big. It could be a small remark, a passing comment, a group decision that felt wrong but was allowed to pass. Why did you stay silent? Because you were unsure? Or because you feared the feeling of being separated from the group? This question is not meant to make you blame yourself. It is meant to help you recognize a habit that has been forming for a very long time. Because when you understand that you were trained this way, you stop labeling yourself as weak or unintelligent. You begin to see that the absence of critical thinking is not a personal flaw, but a neglected capacity. The solution here is not to suddenly become someone who always opposes, always argues, always goes against the majority. That is simply another form of extremism. A softer, more sustainable solution is to gradually reclaim the right to doubt as a basic right of living. Start with small questions, questions that do not attack, that do not aim to prove you are right, but that seek clarity. What assumption is this based on? Is there another possibility? What if we look at this from a different angle? Such questions do not destroy order. They simply create space. More importantly, they reconnect you with your own judging function. Each time you allow yourself to ask a question, even a small one, you send a counter-signal to yourself. My thinking has value. My sense of doubt deserves to be heard. And the most important thing to remember in this sign is this. Self-respect does not begin with opposing the crowd. It begins with not automatically bowing to the crowd when something inside you has not yet agreed. Daring to think differently when necessary may simply mean daring to hold on to a question, daring not to nod too quickly, daring to stay with uncertainty. That is not rebellion. It is the first step toward reclaiming the right to think as a natural part of who you are. And if, at the end of this sign, you realize something very simple, that you are neither unintelligent nor weak, but simply carrying a habit trained early on, then that is already an important awakening. Because what has been trained can also be undone. And that journey always begins with the courage to look directly at how you learned to become obedient in the first place. Sign 2. The brain prefers shortcuts over truth. And even when no one is forcing you to conform to a social norm anymore, most of us still voluntarily choose fast, familiar, and comfortable answers because deep thinking always demands more energy than we are willing to spend. No one forces you to believe too quickly. No one forbids you from stopping to think. Yet somehow, you still find yourself leaning toward conclusions that are neat, clear, and decisive even though they may not be correct. Not because you are not intelligent, but because the human brain is not designed to enjoy ambiguity. Human beings are deeply uncomfortable without an answer. We are not at ease with open questions, with not yet knowing, with issues that cannot be cleanly divided into black and white. Uncertainty creates a very particular kind of restlessness, like standing at a crossroads with no signposts. You feel unsettled. You want to move forward. And to move forward, you feel compelled to choose a direction. And when the state of not knowing becomes unbearable, people will actively choose any answer at all, just to avoid staying with uncertainty for one more second. So the brain offers a quick solution. Choose the most familiar answer, the one that sounds the most reasonable, and most importantly, the one that helps you feel less anxious. The dominant emotion here is not stupidity or indifference. It is impatience, mild tension. A feeling of, I don't like this being unclear. When faced with a complex issue, your brain does not ask, is this true? It asks, what will make me feel less uncomfortable right now? And most of the time, the answer is not more thinking, but a quick closure. Carl Jung pointed out that the human ego is always seeking psychological stability. When confronted with inner conflict, with contradictory information, with the possibility of being wrong, the ego responds by avoiding. It does not like internal tension. It does not like being shaken. And one of the easiest ways to avoid that unease is to cling to familiar beliefs. It does not matter how true those beliefs are, as long as they help you feel that you are standing on solid ground. This is a deeply human mechanism. No one needs to manipulate you. You do it yourself. You choose what is familiar, because familiarity gives you a sense of safety. You choose a position instead of sitting with the problem. You choose a label instead of digging into the essence. Not because you are lazy, but because your brain is trying to conserve energy and reduce anxiety. Notice how this shows up in everyday life. You read a headline and feel like you have understood the issue, even though you have not read the rest. You hear an opinion that matches your existing emotions and feel a sense of relief, as if someone has finally said exactly what you were thinking. You quickly take a side, not because you have weighed all perspectives, but because staying in the middle exhausts you. In a neutral position, you have to endure the tension of not knowing whether you are right or wrong, and the brain does not like that. There is an uncomfortable truth that few people admit. Many people are not afraid of thinking incorrectly. They are afraid of thinking for too long. Afraid of holding a question in their mind without an answer. Afraid of the floating, unsettled feeling. Afraid of having to admit, I don't understand this yet. And so they choose the feeling of having an answer, even if that answer is built on very little reflection. Here, critical thinking does not disappear because people do not want the truth. It disappears because truth often arrives slowly, messily, and without offering immediate reassurance. Meanwhile, cognitive shortcuts are fast, clear, and comforting. The brain, like any system, will choose the less costly path unless there is a strong enough reason to do otherwise. You can recognize this sign in yourself if you observe honestly. When you encounter a controversial issue, what is your first reaction? Curiosity or irritation? Do you tend to ask more questions, or do you want to conclude quickly so it can be over? Are you willing to say, I don't know yet, and leave it there? Or do you need an immediate answer to calm your mind? When was the last time you changed your mind after hearing an opposing argument? Or do you mostly seek out what reinforces what you already believe? The key question here is not which side you are on. It is this: are you thinking, Or are you simply reacting to relieve an inner discomfort? The solution to this sign does not lie in forcing yourself to think more in a strained way. It lies in learning how to slow down at critical points. Choose a few issues that truly affect your life, your values, and your decisions, and allow yourself not to have an immediate answer. Allow ambiguity to exist a little longer. Allow that discomfort to stay, instead of rushing to push it away with a convenient conclusion. This sounds simple, but in practice, it requires a very quiet form of courage. The courage not to rush to take a side. The courage to say, I need more time. The courage to tolerate uncertainty without immediately turning it into belief. When you do this, you are moving against the natural inertia of the brain, and that is precisely where critical thinking begins to come back to life. In the end, intelligence does not lie in the speed of your reaction, nor in how quickly you can produce an answer. Intelligence lies in the capacity to tolerate uncertainty without panic, the capacity to stay with a question long enough for truth to have a chance to emerge. And when you understand this, you may feel a sense of relief. It is not that you are unintelligent, and it is not that you lack freedom. You were simply never taught how to go against the very natural inertia of your own brain. Sign 3. The more voices there are, the less thinking happens. You stop thinking not because you are inadequate, but because for many years, obedience has been paired with a sense of safety, while difference has consistently been associated with risk. But a deeper paradox begins to appear when people enter a crowd. The more people speak up together, the narrower each individual's capacity for independent thought becomes. Not because they become less intelligent, but because they are no longer in a position where they must personally take responsibility for their own thinking. At the collective level, a very familiar phenomenon occurs. Though it is rarely named, opinions appear densely, viewpoints spread everywhere. Everyone has something to say. But understanding remains thin, not because people lack the ability to understand deeply, but because within that shared emotional space, no one truly pauses to think a matter through to the end. Things are reacted to far more than they are reflected upon. The dominant emotion of this state is anger that flares quickly and fades just as fast. An event emerges. The crowd erupts in outrage, indignation, judgment. Strong words are thrown out. Very confident, very decisive. But only a few days later, sometimes only a few hours later, that emotion dissipates. No one remembers what they were once angry about. No one follows up to see whether the issue was ever properly understood. Emotion comes quickly, and leaves behind very little real understanding. Carl Jung once wrote a very short but piercing line. A crowd is not an individual. What Jung was pointing out is not that crowds are always wrong, but that when individuals dissolve into a collective, they no longer operate through personal consciousness. They operate through a deeper layer, the collective unconscious. Within the collective unconscious, emotion spreads faster than reason. Individual judgment dissolves into shared feeling. People stop asking, "What do I think?" and unconsciously shift to the question, "What are we feeling?" And when that shared emotion becomes strong enough, it turns into the sole compass for behavior. At that point, having an opinion is no longer the result of thinking, but an unspoken obligation. Saying nothing is seen as indifference. Not reacting is seen as a lack of stance. Not choosing a side is seen as ambiguity. You do not need to understand the issue to participate. You only need to catch the shared emotional rhythm. And once you do, you are accepted, included, allowed to belong. Notice how this appears in very ordinary situations. A heated debate breaks out around an event you only know through a few summarized lines. You do not fully grasp the context, nor understand all the parties involved. Yet you feel an urge to say something. Staying silent feels uncomfortable. Speaking out feels relieving. Not because you have thought carefully, but because silence at that moment makes you feel disconnected. Or in a conversation among friends, the group quickly aligns in one direction. You have a small suspicion that the issue is not that simple, but you do not speak up. Not because you lack thoughts, but because you clearly sense the risk. If you say something different, you will become the one who is out of sync. The atmosphere will grow tense, and so you choose to go along, even though inwardly you do not fully agree. What matters is this: many others in that crowd are doing the same thing. They, too, have unspoken questions. But because no one speaks first, the shared emotion continues to dominate. And one by one, people dissolve themselves into that current. This is the moment when individual intelligence does not disappear in an instant, but is gradually worn down. Each time you react according to the collective emotion instead of your own thinking, a small portion of your personal judgment is set aside. It does not hurt. It is not loud. But repeated often enough, you begin to react faster than you think. You believe you have a position, but in reality, it is a position borrowed from the crowd. A very clear sign of this state is the feeling that you must have an opinion, not because you understand, but because you fear being left out. Fear the feeling of not belonging. And at a deeper level, that fear outweighs the desire for understanding. The collective unconscious works precisely at this point. It gives you a sense of safety through belonging, in exchange for your independent thinking identity. Ask yourself honestly, in the moments when you have reacted most strongly recently, did you truly understand what you were reacting to? Or were you simply feeling what many people around you were feeling? Is this your thought, or is it an emotion passing through you? This question is not meant to accuse you. It simply helps you recognize a fragile moment, the moment when you are no longer yourself. And in that moment, individual intelligence is not wrong. It is simply pushed aside to make room for collective emotion. The solution to this sign does not lie in fighting the crowd or trying to appear different. It lies in a very quiet, yet powerful choice: conscious silence. Not silence out of fear, but silence because you do not yet understand enough to speak. Not everything needs a response. Not every emotion needs to be expressed immediately. Preserving the self sometimes begins with not participating in the noise, with granting yourself the right to stand aside, observe, and speak only when your thoughts truly belong to you. And when you grasp this, you may come to realize something essential. There are times when you are not thinking incorrectly. Rather, you have momentarily stopped being yourself. If you have made it this far, thank you for taking the time to listen all the way to this point. What we have just touched on is not comfortable, but it is necessary. If this content helped you slow down even a little, or see yourself more clearly, consider liking and sharing it with someone you think might also need a pause like this. Now, we move on to sign 4, where the issue no longer lies in the crowd outside, but in the dialogue that is gradually disappearing within you. Sign 4. The loss of inner dialogue. Carl Jung once wrote, "Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes." When people stop listening inwardly, they begin to seek every answer outside themselves. And once they grow accustomed to thinking with others, thinking like others, reacting in a shared rhythm, they gradually lose something more important than knowledge itself: the ability to sit with themselves and with a question that has no immediate answer. This loss is not loud. It does not resemble a collapse or an obvious crisis. It happens quietly, little by little. At first, you simply notice that you no longer enjoy being alone the way you once did. Then you realize that when facing a decision, your first reflex is no longer, "What do I think?" but "What are others saying?" You no longer sit with the question. You search for an answer immediately, from anywhere, at all, as long as it helps you escape the hollow feeling that comes with having to think on your own. Behaviorally, this shows up very clearly. You rarely let an issue sit overnight. You no longer have patience for ambiguity. A small discomfort arises when you do not yet have a conclusion, and you rush to fill it with other people's opinions. Not because you trust them more than yourself, but because you are no longer accustomed to being alone with your own thoughts. The dominant emotional tone of this state is a very particular sense of disorientation. You may know many things. You read a lot, hear a lot, encounter countless viewpoints. Yet inside, there is a hard-to-name emptiness, a strange hollowness, as if everything passes through you, but does not truly touch you. You know, but you are not certain, and the more you know, the more that unease can sometimes grow. Jung believed that when the ego is continuously overwhelmed by external voices, The self, the deeper, central core of the human being, no longer has space to appear. The self is not only the center but also the whole circumference which embraces both conscious and unconscious. When people no longer make room for personal reflection, for inner dialogue, they lose contact with the deepest part of themselves, not because the self disappears, but because it is no longer listened to. This explains why many people live very correct lives, very reasonable, very up-to-date, yet constantly feel uneasy. They make choices based on what is considered right, popular, safe. They do what everyone does. But after each such choice, the sense of reassurance lasts only briefly. Then a vague anxiety returns. Not because the choice was wrong, but because it was not truly theirs. You can see this in very ordinary examples. Someone chooses a job that is widely seen as stable, praised by many, reassuring to the family. Yet every night, when everything quiets down, they feel a heaviness inside. There is no clear reason, just a sense of misalignment. Or someone enters a relationship because it's the right age, because everyone does it, because people say it's good. But the longer they stay in it, the more alien they feel to themselves. Another sign is the fear of being alone with one's thoughts. Silence is no longer a place of rest, but something that must be filled. You turn on music, open your phone, find something to do. Not necessarily because you are busy, but because you are not accustomed to sitting still and listening to what is speaking inside you. And gradually, that inner voice grows quieter, fainter, not because it is weak, but because you no longer return to listen. Notice how you have been making decisions lately. When facing an important choice, do you take time to sit with it? Or do you rush to ask for opinions, seek advice, read viewpoints, check reviews, until there are enough voices that you no longer have to hear yourself? Are you living by borrowed opinions, rather than by a sense of understanding that comes from within? The identifying question here is very simple, yet very difficult to answer honestly. When was the last time you sat quietly with a question, without rushing to find an answer? Not 5 minutes of skimming, but truly staying with it, letting it make you uncomfortable, letting it open contradictions, letting it force you to face yourself. The solution to this sign does not lie in thinking more or learning more. It lies in restoring the habit of reflection, a very old, very simple habit that has become increasingly rare. Writing down what you are thinking, not to post, not for anyone else to read, but so you can see yourself. Walking without listening to anything, without a goal, simply allowing thoughts to move on their own. Choosing deliberate silence, not to avoid, but to create space for the inner voice to return. Jung emphasized that psychological maturation does not occur in noise, but in moments when people dare to be alone with themselves. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. When inner dialogue disappears, what slowly dies inside is not intelligence, but the vitality of the self. You exist, but you no longer truly live from within. In the end, there is an uncomfortable yet essential truth. No one can think for you. No one can live for you. No one can take responsibility for your deepest choices. That is both a burden and a freedom. A burden, because you cannot avoid it forever. A freedom, because when you dare to return and listen inwardly, you begin to live a life that is no longer borrowed. And if, after all this, you realize that you have lost something along the way, it is likely not knowledge. It is your own inner voice, the part of you that once knew very clearly what was right for you, even when it did not align with the voice of the majority. Sign 5. When truth loses to virality. And then, within a space where speed and consensus are celebrated, the value of an idea no longer lies in how true it is, but in how many people believe in it. What spreads the fastest is rarely what is most accurate. Yet what makes this phenomenon dangerous is not the existence of falsehood itself, but the way falsehood can cloak itself in the appearance of certainty simply through the number of people who support it. People do not believe something only because it has evidence. Very often, they believe because everyone around them believes it. An idea repeated often enough begins to resemble truth. No, verification, required. No need to understand it at its roots. No need to go against the current. Standing with the crowd is enough. And that feeling of standing together provides a powerful sense of psychological safety. A close look at behavior here reveals a familiar pattern. People evaluate ideas by the number of those who agree with them, rather than by their level of accuracy. A claim repeated by many starts to seem right. A conclusion shared widely becomes hard to be wrong. And once the majority has taken a side, questioning it begins to feel bothersome, even dangerous. Not because the question is unreasonable, but because it disrupts the shared sense of certainty. The dominant emotion driving this behavior is the fear of being left out, the fear of being seen as different, the fear of being considered naive, outdated, or out of touch. Deep down, very few people fear the truth itself. They fear loneliness. And when faced with a choice between holding an unverified belief shared by many and standing alone with a doubt no one else seems to share, most will choose the former. Carl Jung once wrote a short sentence that cuts straight to this mechanism. Thinking is difficult. That's why most people judge. When thinking becomes difficult, judgment becomes an escape. And collective judgment, repeated en masse, gives people the feeling that they are standing on solid ground. Not because that ground is true, but because it is crowded. At the unconscious level, what is operating here is not reason, but herd instinct. When this instinct is activated, safety is prioritized over truth. Standing with the crowd means minimizing the risk of exclusion, and the brain, programmed to avoid social danger, naturally leans toward this option. No coercion is needed. No manipulation is required. The mere sense that everyone thinks this way is enough. You can see this clearly in everyday situations. A piece of information appears, widely shared, accompanied by firm assertions. You do not see a clear source, nor specific evidence, yet you do not question it much. Because if so many people believe it, there must be some reason. You nod. You share it onward. This, missed. Not necessarily because you understand it, but because you do not want to be the one standing outside that consensus. Or when a particular opinion becomes popular within your group of friends, your workplace, or the community you belong to, you sense that it is not entirely convincing. But you also realize something else. If you voice your doubt, you will have to explain a great deal. You will become the one who makes things complicated. Meanwhile, silent agreement allows everything to move along much more smoothly. So you choose short-term peace, trading away the ability to stand firmly with your own thinking. This is where false certainty is formed, a belief built not on understanding, but on repetition, a sense of rightness that comes not from reason, but from constant reinforcement by the majority. And the more people believe it, the harder it becomes to shake. Not because it is solid, but because doubting it means separating oneself from the community. The most dangerous aspect of this mechanism is not that people believe incorrectly, but that they stop distinguishing between what is true and what is believed. When these two concepts merge, truth no longer holds a central position. It becomes something that can be replaced by anything that spreads fast enough and wide enough. Ask yourself honestly, how many beliefs are you carrying simply because everyone says so? How many conclusions have you accepted without truly understanding them? When you agree with a popular viewpoint, do you do so because you have examined it carefully, or because you do not want to fall out of step? Do you believe this because you understand it, or because everyone believes it? This question is not meant to make you doubt everything, but to help you recognize a very delicate boundary, the boundary between understanding and consensus. A person can reach consensus very quickly, but understanding always arrives more slowly. And without that slowness, individual intelligence has no chance to emerge. The solution to this sign does not lie in deliberately opposing the majority or seeking difference at all costs. It lies in a very specific attitude, seeking out opposing perspectives, not to refute them, but to understand. When an idea is widely believed, ask who does not believe it, and why. Not to take their side, but to test whether your belief can stand without the backing of the crowd. This requires a very quiet form of intellectual self-respect. Self-respect is not believing you are more right than others. Self-respect is the ability to stand with your own thinking even when it is not welcomed. It is the ability to endure the feeling of not being supported without hastily abandoning truth, just to regain a sense of belonging. No matter how uncomfortable it may be, there is always one hard truth that remains. Believing something does not make it true. It only makes you less alone. And if you dare to face this directly, you will understand why collective ignorance can become dangerous. Not because people lack intelligence, but because they are too afraid to stand alone with a truth that no one else has yet acknowledged. Sign 6. The ability to think deeply is gradually shrinking. What is most concerning is not that people do not want to think independently, but that after too many years of living in a rushed and fragmented rhythm, they begin to lose the capacity to think a single issue through to the end, not because they are lazy, not because they do not care, but because the ability to sit with an idea long enough has been worn down little by little, to the point that when it is needed, it no longer responds. Carl Jung emphasized a very fundamental principle about the maturation of consciousness. The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect but by the play instinct acting from inner necessity. Consciousness needs space and time in order to grow. When one of these is missing, what remains is not thinking, but mere reflex, a chain of quick, familiar, and shallow responses to constant stimulation. If you look at everyday life, you will see this sign appear in very small behaviors that repeat again and again. Difficulty finishing a long article. Difficulty following an argument for more than a few paragraphs. Reading, and then feeling mental fatigue. Restlessness, wanting to scroll down to find the ending. Or, while thinking about an issue, your hand automatically opens another tab, another topic, another fragment of information. Not because the original subject is unimportant, but because staying with it begins to feel uncomfortable. A close examination of behavior here reveals a clear decline in capacity. Fragmented thinking. Consciousness is split into thin slices. Each slice is only sufficient to take in a short, quick, easily digestible piece of information. But when synthesis is required, when connection is needed, when a whole picture must be seen, consciousness no longer has enough energy. It is like a muscle that has long been used only lightly. When asked to sustain a longer movement, it quickly tires and gives out. The dominant emotion accompanying this state is a peculiar kind of restlessness, not intense stress, but a low-grade mental fatigue. You feel as though you take in many things throughout the day, yet by the end of the day, you feel empty. There is a sense of being hungry for meaning, yet not enough patience to dig deeply into anything that could provide that meaning. This very contradiction leads many people to misunderstand themselves. They assume they lack motivation, when in reality, they lack the capacity to sustain attention long enough. At the unconscious level, what is occurring is not laziness, but the fragmentation of consciousness. When consciousness is continuously stretched, cut up, and redirected, it loses the ability to accumulate energy. Jung warned that when consciousness is not strong enough to hold a center, people live in a state of being led by external stimuli, rather than actively orienting their own thinking. No center, no depth, only scattered reactions. You can recognize this through very ordinary examples. A book you were once excited to buy, yet never managed to finish. Not because it is bad, but because each time you pick it up, your mind quickly grows tired. Or an important personal issue that requires serious reflection, yet you keep postponing it, not because you do not care, but because each time you think about having to go deep, you feel discouraged before you even begin. Instead, you choose activities that feel lighter, even though you know they solve nothing. Or at work, you may be accustomed to handling many small, quick, scattered tasks. You respond to messages rapidly, reply to emails succinctly. But when you need to sit down to build a long-term strategy or think through a complex problem, you find it difficult to start, difficult to sustain, and easy to get distracted, not because you lack ability, but because your attention system has grown accustomed to being fragmented. The identifying question here is very direct. Do you still have enough patience to understand an issue all the way through? Not just skimming to get a general sense, but staying with it until you truly understand what you are thinking. When faced with a difficult problem, is your first reflex to go deeper or to find a quicker way out of the discomfort? Many people are surprised to realize that they do not actually hate deep thinking. They only hate the fatigue that appears almost immediately when they begin, and because this fatigue arrives so early, they assume they are not suited for serious thought. In truth, it is a sign of a capacity that has been neglected for too long. The solution to this sign does not lie in forcing yourself to become more intelligent or more disciplined in an extreme way. It lies in gradually restoring a capacity that has atrophied. Reading deeply, but starting with short, intentional periods. Reading not to consume, but to understand. Reducing fragmented information intake not by cutting yourself off from the world, but by choosing more carefully. Less, but deeper. Alongside reading, contemplation must also be restored as a way of living. Walking without listening to anything else. Writing down your thoughts, instead of keeping them only in your head. Allowing a question to remain long enough without demanding an immediate answer. These things may sound simple, but they are precisely how space and time are recreated for consciousness. Two conditions, Jung regarded as foundational for inner maturation. In the end, one uncomfortable truth must be faced directly. Collective ignorance does not arise because people lack intelligence. It arises because people gradually abandon their own right to think not through one major decision, but through thousands of small daily choices, in which they choose what is easier instead of what is deeper. Returning to the self does not mean withdrawing from the world, nor does it mean living slowly in an extreme way. It is the ability to stand within the world with a clear mind and an inner life that has boundaries. When you regain the capacity to think deeply, you are not only resisting collective ignorance, but reclaiming a very fundamental part of personal freedom, the right to understand your own life all the way through. If you have walked with me through these 6 signs, you may be beginning to recognize one thing. Critical thinking does not disappear because people are less intelligent, but because too many aspects of modern life quietly push us to abandon it. Yet these 6 signs are still not the whole picture. When looking more deeply through the lens Carl Jung once opened, there are at least 4 deeper causes still at work, rooted in personal responsibility, inner morality, emotions that remain unexamined, and the illusion of knowledge continuing to erode humanity's capacity for independent thought. And it is there that the question is no longer who is right and who is wrong, but whether we still have the courage to think for ourselves and take responsibility for our own thinking. Leave a comment such as, "I am ready," so that we can move together into the final 4 signs, where the issue no longer lies in society, but in the very personal choices each individual makes. Sign 7. People fear the responsibility of thinking for themselves. There is a truth few people say out loud. It is not that people do not know how to think, but that they fear the feeling of having to take responsibility for their own thoughts. To think for oneself means to choose for oneself, to be wrong by oneself, to bear the consequences alone. And in a world where psychological safety is valued more highly than inner maturity, many people have chosen an easier path, letting others think for them. On the surface, this choice appears harmless. You do not cause trouble. You are not scrutinized. You do not have to stand up and defend a viewpoint that might be challenged. But at a deeper level, this is a major concession. When you are no longer the one who decides, you are also no longer the one who is responsible. And that sense of relief, if sustained long enough, becomes a psychological habit, the habit of avoidance. Observe everyday life closely. A meeting where someone clearly sees a risk, yet remains silent because surely others have already thought about it. An important personal decision made based on common advice, not because it truly fits, but because, if it goes wrong, at least it won't be my fault. Or moments when you nod in agreement with something you do not truly believe, simply to avoid the loneliness of standing on the other side. In those moments, you do not lack the ability to think. You are choosing not to be the decision maker. The dominant emotion beneath this choice is not laziness, but anxiety. Anxiety about the possibility of being wrong. Anxiety about being judged. And deeper still, existential anxiety. The fear of having to live with the consequences of taking responsibility for one's own inner life. Thinking independently is not merely an intellectual activity. It is an inner moral act. It places you in the position of saying, "This is my choice," and accepting whatever follows. At a deeper psychological level, Carl Jung described this as an avoidance of the process of becoming oneself. He once wrote, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of its parents." When a person does not live their own inner life, they often carry the patterns, beliefs, and judgments of others, like a suit of armor. This armor provides safety, but it also prevents them from ever touching their true self. Avoiding individuation is not a dramatic act. It happens very quietly. You hand over judgment to an external authority, someone considered more knowledgeable, a system believed to be already validated, or simply a common norm that spares you from facing uncertainty. When you say, "They're probably right," you are not merely trusting others. You are withdrawing from the position of responsibility. The danger lies in this. The longer you do this, the lighter you feel. Lighter because you no longer have to strain. Lighter because you no longer have to face inner conflict. Lighter because you no longer have to ask difficult questions. But this relief comes at a very high cost. It erodes your sense of self-respect. You gradually lose confidence in your ability to judge, to discern, to stand on your own. And when critical thinking is needed, you realize you no longer have either the habit or the courage to use it. Notice a very ordinary detail. Many people say, "I'm not really knowledgeable about this." Even when the issue directly affects their lives, this statement does not always reflect a lack of understanding. Sometimes, it is a safe retreat. If I don't know, I don't have to take responsibility. If I just follow along, I don't have to question anything. And if things go wrong, the fault does not belong to me. Here, critical thinking does not disappear because it is forbidden. It disappears because it is treated as a burden, the burden of living as a psychologically mature person, the burden of asking one's own questions, facing inner contradictions, and accepting the possibility of being wrong. In an environment where safety is prioritized above all else, very few people are encouraged to carry that burden. The central question this sign answers is, why do so many people not want to think, even though they are fully capable of doing so? Because thinking not only requires energy, but also courage. Courage to choose, courage to be wrong, and courage to refrain from blaming others when things do not go as planned. You can recognize this sign in yourself with a very simple question. When was the last time you made a decision based truly on your own judgment? And were you willing to take responsibility for it? Or did you choose the option that was recommended by many, safe, hard to criticize, even though part of you did not fully agree? The solution to this sign is not rebellion, nor is it rejecting all external opinions. It begins with accepting a difficult truth. No one can live your inner life for you. You can listen, consult, and learn, but the final moment of decision cannot be outsourced forever. Practice asking yourself, if this choice turns out to be wrong, am I willing to take responsibility? If the answer is yes, you are taking a very important step back toward independent thinking. At the end of this sign's journey, I hope you can look back at yourself gently but clearly. Abandoning critical thinking was not because you were weak or unintelligent, but because you were afraid of living with the consequences of thinking for yourself. And in recognizing that, you may also recognize something else. That fear is not a verdict. It is simply an invitation to begin growing more mature inwardly, one small choice at a time. Sign 8. Morality replaced by position. There was a time when people consistently asked, "Is this right?" Now, the more common question has become, "What does our side think about this?" When position becomes the guiding compass, morality is no longer an inner process of judgment, but merely loyalty to one side. And from there, right and wrong are gradually replaced by us versus them. This shift does not happen overnight. It unfolds very quietly, almost reasonably. Standing on one side always brings a sense of safety. You do not have to think too much. You do not have to endure ambiguity. You do not have to face the possibility that you might be wrong. You simply identify your side. and everything else becomes simple. Whatever your side supports is right. Whatever the other side does is wrong. Morality is reduced to a group identification maneuver. The problem is that when morality is no longer a process of personal reflection, it loses its core function. Morality was never meant to make people feel comfortable. It exists to make people pause, to question themselves, to confront gray zones where no ready-made answers exist. Position, on the other hand, promises immediate reassurance. As long as you stand on the right side, you can stop thinking and still feel like a good person. Observe very ordinary situations. A wrongful act is overlooked because that person belongs to our side. A hurtful statement is justified because the intention was good. An injustice is ignored because the other side is worse. In those moments, it is not that people fail to recognize what is wrong. They choose not to look at it directly, because looking directly would mean having to question the very position they are relying on. The dominant emotion sustaining this state is a false sense of reassurance. Reassurance because you are not alone. Reassurance because you are on the right side of history. Reassurance because you do not have to personally shoulder moral responsibility. But the price of that reassurance is the dilution of individual conscience. When all moral judgment is delegated to the group, people no longer need to develop their own capacity to distinguish right from wrong. Carl Jung warned very clearly about this danger when he wrote, "The individual who does not integrate his shadow will inevitably project it onto others." When the ego identifies itself with a group, the personal shadow does not disappear. It is merely pushed outward and assigned to the other side. From there, all evil is seen in others, while oneself and one's group remain pure. This is not deliberate malice. It is a deeply human psychological mechanism. For this reason, the most dangerous forms of evil in history rarely come from those who see themselves as evil. They come from people who believe they are doing the right thing because they stand on the right side. When thinking is delegated, morality ceases to be an inner voice and becomes a collective slogan. And at that point, good people can still support what is wrong, even do what is wrong, without feeling that they are betraying their conscience. You can see this sign in everyday debates. When a person no longer asks, "Is this reasonable?" but only asks, "Who said this?" When arguments are judged not by their content, but by their source. When criticism is mistaken for betrayal, and loyalty is valued more highly than honesty. In such an environment, critical thinking has no room to exist, because it threatens group cohesion. What is troubling is that this state often wears a very moral appearance. People speak of justice, righteousness, and proper values, but rarely speak of personal responsibility and moral judgment. Morality becomes an identity rather than an inner act. And once morality becomes an identity, it no longer needs to be examined, it only needs to be defended. Ask yourself an uncomfortable question. How many times have you agreed with or remained silent about something you felt was not right, simply because it came from your side? Not because you failed to recognize the problem, but because speaking up would mean being seen as standing on the wrong side. In that moment, what was prioritized? Honesty toward your conscience, or the feeling of belonging? The solution to this sign does not lie in abandoning all positions or living in a false neutrality. It lies in restoring personal, moral authority and responsibility. You can still belong to a community, a value system, a direction, but that does not grant you permission to stop questioning. A healthy position does not fear scrutiny. Only weak positions need to silence conscience. Practice asking the old question again, even if it is no longer popular. Is this right, even when my side supports it? Is this fair, even when it benefits my side? These questions do not make you a traitor. They simply return you to being a person with an inner moral compass. And there is one thing I need you to remember clearly. The most dangerous thing is not open malice or hostility. The most dangerous thing is when our morality is no longer born from within, but is merely something we borrow from a side in order to feel safer. At that point, the question is no longer which side we stand on, but whether we still dare to stand on the side of our own conscience. Sign 9. People confuse Strong emotions with deep thinking. Modern society is quietly pushing people into a dangerous confusion. The more outraged, moved, or certain they feel, the more they believe they understand the issue clearly. A wave of anger, an intense sense of empathy, and in that very moment, we believe we have touched the truth. But strong emotion is not always a sign of depth. Sometimes, it is simply noise loud enough to cover the fact that we have not actually thought things through. There is a very subtle mechanism here that few people want to look at directly. Genuine thinking always comes with ambiguity. When we think deeply, we are not immediately certain. We have to stay with the question, with unanswered gaps, with the possibility that we might be wrong. That is uncomfortable. Strong emotion, by contrast, offers something very seductive: instant certainty. When we are angry, we clearly see who is wrong. When we are moved, we clearly see what is right. When we are intensely stimulated, the world suddenly feels simple, tidy, clearly divided, and it is precisely this false clarity that leads to confusion. We believe we are thinking, when in fact we are merely reacting. In everyday life, this confusion appears in very familiar situations. A story is told with intense indignation, and after hearing only a few details, we feel our blood boil. We do not check further, do not ask follow-up questions, do not slow down. We simply hold on to that emotion, because it gives us the feeling that we are standing on the right side. Or there is a moment of strong emotion stirred by a beautiful story or a moving statement, and we rush to conclude, this must be the truth. We fail to distinguish between being emotionally touched and actually understanding. Carl Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Strong emotions, whether anger or deep feeling, often arise when something within us has been touched, especially parts that have not yet been understood. Instead of sitting with that reaction and asking why we respond so strongly, we usually choose to project the emotion outward. We attach it to the issue, to other people, to circumstances. Emotion then becomes an escape. It allows us to avoid confronting the ambiguity inside ourselves. This is exactly the mechanism Jung called shadow projection. Emotions that have not been digested, not truly understood, will seek an outlet. When we become angry too quickly, it may not be only because of the immediate situation, but because it touches an old feeling, being dismissed, overlooked, treated unfairly. Yet instead of recognizing this, we believe our anger is proof that we see the issue clearly. Emotion now functions like a curtain. It hides the fact that we have not analyzed, not reflected, not followed the matter through to the end. One important thing to note is that strong emotion is very convincing. When we speak from a place of outrage or deep feeling, our words sound heavier. We speak faster, more confidently, with fewer hesitations, and so a loop is formed. Strong emotion creates a sense of correctness. That sense of correctness reinforces the belief that we have thought enough, and from there, we see no reason to think any further. In everyday conversations, this happens constantly. One person recounts an event with intense anger. The listener does not ask for more details, is not curious about the context, does not question back. As long as the emotion is strong enough, it feels sufficient. Both feel they have understood. But in reality, what is being shared and received is not understanding, but emotional resonance. Or consider moments when we feel extremely certain about a particular viewpoint. That certainty arrives so quickly that we cannot even remember when we actually thought it through. We only remember the feeling, right, clear, indisputable. But if we look closely, we will see that this certainty often does not come from analysis, but from emotion having filled the entire space. When emotion fills everything, questions have no room to exist. Carl Jung warned, emotion is the chief source of all becoming conscious. But he also emphasized that if emotion is not brought into consciousness with clarity, it will not lead to understanding, works, but only to reaction. Emotion itself is not the problem. The problem arises when we stop at emotion and mistake it for intelligence. A very clear sign of this confusion is that the more certain someone feels, the less they want to dig deeper. Any question is perceived as an attack. Any slowing down is seen as hesitation. Curiosity disappears, leaving only defensiveness. And at that moment, critical thinking vanishes, not because we are unintelligent, but because we have given all the space to emotion. If you look back at the moments when you reacted most strongly, you may notice an uncomfortable truth. Those are often the moments when you could not tolerate ambiguity. You wanted to close the issue quickly. You wanted a conclusion so you would not have to remain in that in-between state. Strong emotion helps accomplish that. It offers an exit, but the price is that thinking stops. So how do we distinguish between emotion and thought? Not by eliminating emotion, but by creating a pause. When emotion rises, instead of speaking immediately or concluding right away, try asking, what in this situation is triggering such a strong reaction in me? Am I understanding the issue, or am I trying to escape an uncomfortable feeling? That pause is very small, but it is where genuine thinking can begin. Carl Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When strong emotion remains unconscious, it directs our reactions, and we label it truth, position, or personal opinion. But when we slow down enough to look at the emotion itself, we gain the chance to separate it from the thinking process. Perhaps the hardest thing is not controlling emotion, but accepting that emotion is not evidence of intelligence. We can feel very strongly, very sincerely, very convinced, and still not have thought enough. Recognizing this does not make us weaker. On the contrary, it opens the door to maturity, the ability to stay with a question longer than our emotions. And at this point, perhaps both you and I can see clearly one thing. Strong emotion is not the enemy of thinking, but confusing it with deep thought is. When we stop using emotion as a shield, we begin to truly think, not to become colder, but to be more honest with ourselves. Sign 10. People confuse knowing with understanding. We are living in an era in which many people know a great many things, yet very few truly understand what they know. Information piles up. Terminology flows endlessly. Concepts follow one another without pause. We can speak fluently about almost any topic, from psychology and society to inner life. But the more knowledgeable people become, the less they tend to ask deep questions. And it is precisely this surface-level fullness that slowly renders critical thinking unnecessary. There is a very comfortable illusion here, the feeling of, I already know this. Once we have heard something, read it, grasped a few familiar keywords, we quickly conclude that we understand. We no longer feel the need to pause, no longer feel the need to dig deeper. I already know that becomes an easy phrase, but it is also the door that closes the thinking process. When we believe we understand, we stop asking questions, and when there are no questions left, critical thinking has no place to exist. In everyday life, this shows up in very small situations. A concept is mentioned repeatedly, and we nod. A sentence sounds familiar, and we immediately agree. An idea is presented in smooth language, and we feel reassured. But if someone asks, what does this actually mean in your own life? We become confused, not because we are unintelligent, but because what we have is only information, never digested into understanding. Carl Jung once wrote, "Knowledge rests not upon truth alone, but upon error also." Understanding does not come from accumulating correct fragments, but from a process of collision, doubt, correction, quote, and connection. Yet when information comes too easily, too quickly, and in excess, we skip that uncomfortable stage. We keep only the feeling, I am updated, I am keeping up, I know. That feeling is very safe, but also very dangerous. Dangerous because knowing does not require us to change. Understanding does. When we truly understand something, we cannot live exactly as before. Understanding brings consequences, responsibility, and the need to adjust how we see, how we live, how we choose. Knowing does not. Knowing allows us to keep everything the same, simply adding a few concepts to our minds. And so many people stop at knowing, not because they lack the ability to understand, but because understanding is an inconvenient process. In conversations, This becomes easy to notice. Some people speak a lot, quote quickly, and use terminology smoothly. But when the discussion goes a little deeper, when ideas need to be connected, when the question, "So what does this actually mean?" arises, everything falls apart. The information is there, but it does not stick together. It is like a room full of furniture with no clear path to walk through. Jung called the process of turning conscious content into lived understanding integration. When knowledge is not integrated, it remains on the surface of consciousness and never touches the real person. And then we easily fall into the state Jung warned about. Thinking is difficult. That's why most people judge. When we do not understand deeply enough, we replace thinking with judgment. We use what we know to reach quick conclusions instead of staying with the question. A very clear sign of confusing knowing with understanding is impatience with depth. We no longer want to listen to a long analysis. We do not want to follow an argument step by step. We prefer neat conclusions, punchy closing lines that feel satisfying, but real understanding is rarely neat. It is often unfinished, open-ended, and forces us to keep thinking after the conversation ends. In personal life, this is especially clear when we apply knowledge to ourselves. We read about emotions, trauma, healing, and we know many terms. But when real emotions arise, we do not know what to do. We have language to describe them, but not the ability to stay with the experience. Knowledge does not help us live differently. It only helps us name what is happening. And we mistake naming for understanding. Carl Jung wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another." There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. Understanding cannot be fully borrowed from others. It has to be walked through via personal experience. But when we consume too much ready-made information, we easily forget this. We take someone else's map and believe we have already walked the path. The more we know, the more defensive we often become toward deep questions. Because deep questions threaten the illusion of understanding. They force us to admit that perhaps we are still standing on the outside. And that feeling is uncomfortable. So we cling tightly to what we know, repeat it, defend it, and use it as a shield. Critical thinking, instead of being used to expand understanding, is turned into a tool to protect surface-level knowledge. Looking back, this may feel familiar. The moments when we are most confident about an issue are often the moments when we least want to learn more. The moments when we say, "This is already clear," are usually the moments when we stop. And at that very stopping point, the process of understanding ends. So what is truly being lost here? Not information, not knowledge, but the ability to turn what we know into something meaningful for our own lives. Understanding does not lie in the quantity of information, but in how deeply it touches the way we see, choose, and live. Carl Jung emphasized, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Understanding always has a cost. It requires us to slow down, to doubt, to accept that we do not yet know." In a world that celebrates constant updates and certainty, this becomes increasingly difficult. And at this point, perhaps both you and I can see one thing clearly. Critical thinking does not die from a lack of data, but from the confusion between knowing and understanding. When we stop at knowing, we lose the drive to think deeply. When we believe we already understand, we stop asking questions. And when there are no questions left, critical thinking becomes an unnecessary burden. What we need is not more information, but less haste. Not knowing more, but allowing ourselves to understand less, yet more deeply. Not chasing every new piece of knowledge, but staying with one question long enough for it to truly transform us. When that happens, critical thinking is no longer a skill to be learned, but a natural consequence of a life with depth. If these lines resonate with you, I would genuinely like to hear your thoughts. Recently, what is something you often say you have already understood, yet, when you live with it, you still feel confused or uncertain? Leave a comment. Sometimes, realizing that we do not understand as much as we think is the very first step for real thinking to begin. We often think that the loss of critical thinking is a problem of society, of education, of the times we live in. But after walking through this entire journey, perhaps both you and I can sense something different. It begins very quietly, with small choices inside each person. From the moment we stop asking questions, from the moment we choose safety over honesty, from the moment we let others think for us, simply so we do not have to bear responsibility for what we believe. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Perhaps critical thinking is not a skill meant to win arguments, but the courage to stay with one's own truth, even when that truth makes us uneasy. You do not need to fight against the whole world. Sometimes, maturity is simply about holding on to the right to think, the right to doubt, and the right not to agree too quickly. And if, in these past moments, you saw yourself somewhere in this story, then you are not lost at all. You are simply beginning to wake up. If you want to continue conversations like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We will meet again in questions that are not easy to answer.